The next thing I would like to look at, this is really unusual, and this is a very personal interpretation of Julian. But Julian offers her book, it took her 20 years of reflections before she wrote it down, the final copy. And she says and that's not the end of it. This was just where she reached the point where she wrote it down. And then she presents it to us. And she says, no, I give this to you. And I'm not holy because I had these visions. But as I share them with you, you can become much more holy than I am by your living out what these visions mean. And so we can reflect on them further. And indeed we must, because we don't live in the world of Julian. We don't live in the 14th and 15th century. We have a different concept of what the world is, what creation is. We have a different concept of what a human being is. We know more about these things. Our culture is more elevated, more sophisticated, and so that our knowledge and our understanding is just expanding beyond all imagining. But still, the truths that were given to Julian in her visions, we now apply to our understanding of our culture, of our world, of our education, of our development of science, of our understanding of the soul and of the universe. And so it's what Jesus says, behold, I make all things new. And I think this is the exciting time in which we live, in spite of the unfortunate experience, for example, of the coronavirus and so forth. There are great things that are already coming from that, and will continue to come. But that's only one thing. There's so many other things, and so in a sense, I apologize for what I'm going to say, because Julian, if Julian were to hear this, say in her 14th century context, Julian would be very surprised, and she would say, Father William, I never said that, but she did. But she said it in a way that can be interpreted for the 21st century. And that's the beauty of Julian. And this is why Julian is so popular today. And she was not very popular in the 600 years from the time of her writing until the say 75 years ago. And that's because the things that Julian said, talking, for example, about the Trinity, the feminine in God, and the salvation of souls, and so forth. These things are so important today that they're very relevant today in ways that they weren't relevant in Julian's time. So now, in chapter 51, in chapter 50, Julian was having a sense of guilt. She goes back and forth. In one of her visions, she said she had consolation, desolation, consolation, desolation. It happened about 40 times, she said. And this was given her to show that this is what is going to happen in our lives, although it's not going to happen at that kind of speed. If that happens to you, I would suggest that you see a psychiatrist. But we do vary, don't we? We go through periods of consolation, then periods of desolation, and so forth. And she wanted to show that even in the context of that, God permits it because he loves us. And this is an occasion when we suffer physically, mentally, spiritually. This is a product of the love of God, which he has permitted in order that he may manifest his compassion, his forgiveness, and his love. So you see, everything is a manifestation of love. And everything, great and small, shall be well. Well, she was going through a period of feeling very, very guilty. She says that, that God did not really talk much about sin in itself. In chapter, I think in her fourth vision, she does mention the devil and that he is condemned to hell forever, but she expresses she's not so sure of her interpretation of that. And other than that, she says, I never saw sin because you can't see sin, because sin is a negation. It's a lack of something. It's not anything positive. So I never had a vision of sin, she says, and I never can. But so in order to console her, God gave her this vision in chapter 51. She says it was corporeal, it was intellectual, and it was locutionary, that she saw things, she heard things, and things were given to her mind and heart that she could not express. And she says that it should never be finished talking about the meaning of this and the different levels of understanding. And it starts out with the corporeal vision, okay? And here's the corporeal vision. You have two people. There's the master or the Lord, and he's sitting on a throne, and he's clothed as the wealthy or the royalty would be. And by the way, speaking of royalty, Julian uses the word the courteous Lord. She uses that 100 times. The Lord in his courtesy and love. The Lord in our courteous Lord in his goodness. Now that's a word that comes directly from the royalty, from the situation in which Julian lived, in which the king was supreme in the country, and anything that the king did was courteous. His courteous majesty was, his being deferential to people less than him. And so she's constantly referring that to the Lord and the master, okay? And he was clothed like a royalty or a lord with the long robes and the long sleeves and so forth. And that was kind of the symbol of wealth and majesty and power. And he was sitting on a throne, and he was in a kind of like how would you say it? Kind of like a desert. In other words, a totally flat land. It was just him sitting there on the throne. And because nothing else really is fitting and to be the milieu in which God lives. So, and then standing to one side of him was another man. Now, in this interpretation, this man is Adam. This man is the first man, and he is dressed as a peasant. He has a smock going to his waist with a hood, and he has short pants just going below his knees, and they're dirty and they're ragged, and there's holes in them and so forth. And he is standing there. You get the impression he's something like someone beginning the 50-yard dash. And what he's doing is he's waiting for his master to give him a command. He's so eager to do his master's will. Now, this is a very, very different from the picture that we get in the Bible. And what Julian is doing here, the extraordinary thing that Julian is doing, and again, she would deny this if I were to point it out to her, but it's still true. Julian reinvented the mythology of the Bible. Julian did not really like, or her visions, or that is God, perhaps, did not really like the way he was presented in the book of Genesis. Now, in the first and second chapters, Julian, I just kind of threw me off here. God is presented, now it's authentic. I'm not saying we're going to throw away the creation accounts. There's two creation accounts, in Genesis. We're not going to throw them away. They were meaningful. They still will have meaning for us. We'll always read them, reflect on them, interpret them. But at the same time, there were elements in them that Julian said, well, maybe she didn't say this, William is saying this. Maybe these were okay for 600 BC. For this tribal people that was wandering in the desert and were nomadic people and lived from hand to mouth and you see God came to them and he put Adam in the Garden of Eden, and they would love to hear about that, and imagine this garden. But then God threatens Adam and Eve. He said, look, I'll put you in this garden, and I'm giving you everything in it, but there's one tree there, don't you dare touch it. And he threatens him with punishment if he does. And then when Adam does and Eve do eat of the apple, God punishes them, kicks them out of the garden, puts an angel with a flaming sword there so that they will never return. And Adam will have to toil the world. Eve will give birth in pain and suffering. And then he gave a promise, of course, of a future Messiah. But at the same time, this was not a very happy situation. So what Julian actually does is she gives us a new interpretation, one that is based on, or rather, let us say God gives to Julian, because God is the author of these visions. God gives to Julian a new understanding of himself, based not on his power and his threats, but rather based on his love, a manifestation of his love. And so this is what Julian is doing now in this picture of the Lord and his servant. The Lord, of course, is God. The servant is Adam. And so here is Julian's mythology, Julian's understanding of God, and one that she will share with us. So the servant then, you see, is standing there with the master and waiting to do his will. And he's just like, bent over, one hand on his knee, his shoulders hinged forward. He's going to dash off the minute his master gives him something. So anxious is he to do his master's will. And then the master looks over to his servant and he quietly says something. And the servant, zoom, he's gone. And he's dashing away so fast that he's to do his master's will. That's all he has in his mind, and it's all he wants to do, and that's his goal. But what happens is he on the way to do his master's will, he falls into a deep ditch. Now, at our monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, we have 40 miles of irrigation ditches. And some of them on the side of the mountain, they're so deep, they're like 30 feet deep, that if you fall into one, you can't get out unless you get somebody there to help you. They can be very dangerous. So this is what happened, though, to the servant. He fell into the ditch. Now, when he fell into the ditch, he tumbled over and over, and he lay at the bottom, and he was just broken. His limbs were broken. he was bleeding copiously. He probably had lost consciousness. He fell to the bottom, and he just lay there suffering. Now, the first and the worst suffering that he had was he could no longer see his master. Now, see, this is the fall of Adam. This is not eating an apple. This is not disobeying God. This is falling because he was rushing to do the will of God. And of course, what he wasn't aware of is this is precisely was the will of God. God can will that suffering only because he knows that he will make of it a consolation and a joy that will make the suffering as nothing. And so Adam, the servant, lies there broken and desolate because he could not see his master. But then he began paying attention to his brokenness. This is the brokenness of the human race, you know. He became, and I'm giving you a second complementary interpretation, which Julian did too. So this is not only Adam, this is the human race, but it's not only Adam and the human race, this is Christ. So you see the servant, the human, all of them, and Christ par excellence, you see, is the one who did the human race. And Julian, she says, he's the second person of the Trinity. He fell not into a ditch, but he fell into the womb of the Virgin Mary. And this is his fall. And because he did that, you see, he became human and he became vulnerable to suffering. And so anyway, and then back now to the servant. He lay there suffering, missing his Lord, and then his own sufferings as he felt them and experienced them, and they were so long, protracted, that he forgot entirely about his Lord. Forgetting entirely the Father, and he just focused on his own pain. Then there we have it. Then we have the brokenness, you see, of the human race coming out, and the brokenness of God the Son, who took upon himself our humanity so that he might share in that brokenness. Well, then the master comes looking for the servant. And he stands there at the edge of the ditch looking down, and he sees his beloved servant, who is in that condition because of his great desire to do God's will. And you know, actually, that this is true of all creation. All creation has this desire to do God's will, whether it's aware of it or not. And so do you and I. But we are fallen, we are broken, and so was Jesus. So there you have the three Adams, if you will, or the three meanings of the servant. Now, in this line, I think this is the most important and beautiful line of the entire revelations of divine love. The master looked down at his servant, and he saw in him no guilt. He saw in him no guilt. God does not see guilt. God does not see sin. God only sees the glory that he will bring about because of sin. When Julian talked to that about him, he said, Julian, sin is necessary. Otherwise, how can I show my forgiveness and my compassion? Now, Julian takes care to warn us. It doesn't mean you can sin, a presumption, well, God's going to make good out of this so I can sin all I want. That's out of the picture entirely. But looking back, on our sin that God has forgiven, and that is just a part of the fallenness of the human race, including the fall of Christ, because Christ has taken upon himself all of our sins. He carries them to the cross. But God looked, when God saw the servant down there, and the servant even had forgotten about God, and the servant was broken and suffering, God knew that he would bring about from this suffering such a joy and such a wondrous consolation that it will be as though these sufferings never existed. And so that's a different mythology, isn't it? And you know what I mean by a mythology. That I'm talking about, as the popes did, especially the last three popes, talked about the Garden of Eden and the fall, Adam and Eve, as a mythology. That is, as an imaginative way of expressing a profound truth. And you see that in the Genesis, that is there, and there are profound truths that are expressed. In Julian, that is there, and there are new profound truths, if you will, or a new way of looking at the old mythology. So I think that's one of the most wonderful and exciting things that we can find in the revelations of divine love.